Hello, I'm Nigel Morris-Cotterill and this is Basics from FinCrimeTV. In this programme, what is a politically exposed person? This programme has been produced to tie in with the Chinwags with the Old Codgers Club series on politically exposed persons. That series looks at the issues facing financial crime, risk and compliance practitioners, such as money laundering reporting officers. I'm going to present the background to the issue that series addresses and explain where the concept of a politically exposed person came from and how it has developed. And with reference to a regulator's material, I'm going to demonstrate how the topic has become complicated and confusing. The Chinwag series can be found at the links below. I should say at the outset that there are many views as to almost everything relating to the PEP or PEP or politically exposed persons regime, including what to call it. It's very likely that others will not agree with some of my interpretation, and that's fine. It's a subject that has been twice presented to the financial world as a fait accompli, and as a result of actions of banks in the United Kingdom, it is presently under review there. But the review is very narrow in scope. In this programme, we're going to take a much broader look at the topic than the review currently being undertaken by the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, which is concentrating on the actions of banks and others in relation to members of the UK's Parliament. I'm going to refer to UK law and regulation because that's what I'm most familiar with, but with every country having its own set of rules, one of the most important points to bear in mind is that these often vary from country to country. So let's start with the definition. What is a politically exposed person? Well, it should be easy. It isn't. Worse, it wasn't easy to start with, but over a period of years, layer upon layer of complexity has been added. I should say that I dislike complexity. It's expensive and it's prone to failure. I would much rather deal with an increase in volume of both data and activity than to have to deal with complexity. Worse, complexity often does not achieve any significant advantage over a simpler approach, except for those who earn fees from explaining and working through that complexity. In the case of the PEP regime, which was originated on a global scale by the Financial Action Task Force, complexity has led to money laundering reporting and other risk and compliance officers being put in a position of making judgments that they are not equipped to make, causing untold stress and excessive workloads. The PEP regime could be simple, or at least much simpler, but to make it so is not within my powers. Worse, as we will see, attempts to make it simpler within your organisation might actually bring you into conflict with your regulator, not because you do too little, but because you do too much. To understand the original approach, we need to understand its purpose. Its purpose is to deal with those who are in a position to be involved in grand corruption, with a particular focus on countries with dictators or super strong leadership, over which there was little or no control by government or the people. Examples are President Marcos of the Philippines and General Sani Abacha of Nigeria, but there are many more. Both of those two operated within a system of democracy that has elections, but their grip on power was such that they were able to steal inconceivable amounts of money from the state, which ultimately means the people. You would not be wrong if you thought of the politically exposed persons regime as a step in the broad direction of economic sanctions against corrupt leaders. It is the concentration on grand corruption or the plunder of a nation's wealth by its leaders that is the first point we should look at. The current version of the Financial Action Task Force's 40 recommendations is that of February 2023, the latest in a series of revisions to the 2012 edition. At Recommendation 12, it says that financial institutions should be required to determine if a person with whom they do business, or with whom they are considering doing business, to determine if that person is a foreign politically exposed person, and to put in place effective Know Your Customer policies and procedures which it calls enhanced due diligence. It also says the requirements for all types of PEP should also apply to family members or close associates of such PEPs. So what does it say a PEP is? It doesn't say. There is an interpretative note. That doesn't say either. But there is a general glossary which serves as a definitions section. That defines both domestic and foreign PEPs as individuals who are or have been entrusted with prominent functions, for example, heads of state or of government, senior politicians, senior government, judicial or military officials, senior executives of state-owned corporations, and important political party officials. So what is the difference between foreign and domestic? Absolutely nothing, except the country in which they hold office. The fact that some countries take the view that domestic PEPs present no greater risk than any other member of the public is somewhat confusing. The definition is extended to those who hold prominent functions in international organisations. This would include the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Authority, the African Union, and some may be surprised to learn, institutions of the European Union. Why? Because Europe is not a country, despite its trappings of nationalism such as the creation of the office of president. Also, the definition limits those to whom it applies. It says, the definition of PEPs is not intended to cover middle-ranking or more junior individuals in the foregoing categories. So if we take the various aspects of the definition at face value, the following are to be considered to be politically exposed persons, regardless of which country they hold office in. Heads of state, kings, queens, and presidents are heads of state. Heads of government, prime ministers are heads of government. Senior politicians, this is more complicated. Are we talking only about national governments, or are we drilling down into the layers of elected officials who exercise policy functions? For example, the Mayor of London and the Governor of California, senior politicians. Do we look at state, county, town, district, even parish councils? Are we talking about ministers? Where into the serried ranks of so-called junior ministers do we stop? As senior government officials. This relates to civil servants, and the question arises to which of the multiple layers of government it relates to. But how senior is senior? If we use the UK's police structure as an example, is the Chief Constable included at all? And if so, is he sufficiently senior? What about a Chief Inspector? He has real power and authority. So do officers right down to street level. Where does the middle ranking and, quote, more junior classification start? What about those who are in senior positions in organisations that don't strictly count as government? For example, regulators. Then there's senior military officials. There are all kinds of complications here, but let's start with an explanation as to why it's here in the first place. First, where a country is ruled by a military dictator or junta, unjust enrichment is almost de rigueur. But surely such persons are already included in the definition of senior politicians because they exercise the function of government. But given that the arms industry has a history of corruption, and that military leaders have, in more cases than you would like to imagine, created fictitious battalions or other units and claimed for all the necessary support for them, and then pocketed the money, it is not surprising that this group has been singled out. Next we come to senior judicial officials. This is a strange description, as it appears to relate to persons other than judges. But as those who deal with the administration of justice system and the development of law are covered under senior government officials, it's logical to assume that this does in fact relate to judges, whether they be elected or appointed. And it is right that judges should be included. In one country I've worked in, the price of a meeting with a judge was a new Jaguar. That meeting was to decide on the amount of a bribe that would be paid for a favourable judgment. But which judges should be included? Magistrates are notoriously biased on all kinds of bases. Should their finances be under scrutiny? That raises many questions, but it gets worse. Let's consider that a foreign politically exposed person aspect. Let's remember the basic principle is that this is ultimately about money laundering, and that in a money laundering scheme, people lie. So there is absolutely no guarantee that if you ask a prospective customer, are you in a senior position of influence, that the answer you get is going to be accurate. There is no consistency from country to country as to what they consider politically exposed persons. Yes, the most senior handful of persons in each classification is universally included, but below that, a vast range of options obtains. So let's take the UK's Financial Conduct Authority's interpretation, that's their word, as an example. It includes heads of state, heads of government, ministers and deputy or assistant ministers, members of parliament or of similar legislative bodies. The Financial Conduct Authority expressly says it does not include government, local government in the UK, note in the UK, but it may, where higher risks are assessed, be appropriate to do so in other countries. Clearly the FCA has not learned about the corruption in obtaining permission for property development in the UK, for example. And then the modifies something in the FATF's list. Members of government bodies of political parties, members of governing bodies of political parties, which have some representation in a national or supranational parliament or similar body. That's a clear reference to the European Parliament, and therefore ensures that those who have executive authority in relation to parties with members of the European Parliament are included. And then the Financial Conduct Authority refers to judges and makes it clear that, except in exceptional circumstances, this relates to courts of final appeal and constitutional courts. Then it gets weird. The usual approach to law and regulation is that sometimes it's better to exceed the requirements. That, it appears, would be a breach of the Financial Conduct Authority's position and may arguably lead to regulatory action. It says that regulated businesses should not treat any other member of the judiciary as a PEP and only apply enhanced due diligence measures where they have assessed additional risks. Well, that smacks of telling banks and so on that they need not be troubled by not knowing what they don't know. There are those that would say that to give judges a free pass, that they are immune from temptation and influence simply because of their office, is a dangerously naive view, especially in a country where it is commonplace for people to have multiple bank accounts and no single institution has a comprehensive view of such people's financial position. There are several others listed. Notable is that the directors, deputy directors and members of the board of international organisations specifically exclude international sporting federations, like FIFA. Given the number of scandals surrounding international sports, this is quite a surprise. Also, in relation to state-owned enterprises, such as sovereign wealth funds, they would have their leaders subject to scrutiny only where the state owns more than half the enterprise. So there are exclusions and limitations, except that, with the exception of the case in relation to judges, there really aren't. In each case there is a caveat that says, in effect, that if circumstances arise where a junior or middle-ranking person might be acting as a front for the denoted PEP, that person should be regarded, in effect, as a PEP. So must families and close associates. That would suggest that the relationship between Greensill Capital's Lex Greensill and the then British Prime Minister David Cameron should have demonstrated Greensill's qualification as a PEP. So what does the Financial Conduct Authority consider to be family members? Below this video there are some links to documents, one of which is the Financial Conduct Authority's current guidance. Paragraph 221, it says, family members of a PEP are defined as including spouse or civil partner, children and their spouses or civil partner, and parents. So, not to put too fine a point on it, mistresses and cohabitees don't count, nor do those in long-term, non-formal relationships, even if they live together, and even if they own property together. Brothers and sisters are, however, included, but not the spouses of brothers and sisters, unlike the spouses of children. Nor are grandchildren or grandparents who are both well established as conduits or repositories for money laundering. But again, while there is a list, the FCA hedges its bets by saying a corrupt PEP may use members of his wider family to launder the proceeds of corruption on his or her behalf. It says, it may be appropriate to include a wider circle of family members, such as aunts and uncles, in cases where a firm has assessed a PEP to pose a higher risk. It also says, a family member of a PEP is not a PEP themselves purely as a consequence of being associated with a PEP. So who does the FCA consider to be a close associate? It's an individual known to have a joint beneficial ownership of a legal entity or a legal arrangement or any other close business relationship with a politically exposed person. Or, and, an individual who has sole beneficial ownership of a legal entity or a legal arrangement that is known to have been set up for the benefit of a PEP. So, think about this. What about blind trusts that hold the assets of senior politicians while they're in office? Who is the beneficial owner of those blind trusts? Is it the trustee? Well, he's certainly he has legal ownership of that legal entity. Again, it's far from clear because the notes do not think through what they're talking about. In many cases, perhaps it would be better not to have the notes at all. It also goes on to say, known close associates of a PEP are not themselves PEPs purely as a consequence of being associated with a PEP. So how long does a PEP remain a PEP? This is a cause for debate. The FCA says that a PEP should remain subject to risk-based enhanced due diligence for at least 12 months after leaving office or post. It says this may be extended, but it is necessary only where the regulated business has assessed that the PEP is a higher risk. That doesn't take account of those who continue to exercise influence long after leaving office, or those who've agreed to accept benefits, including jobs or being paid huge sums for a lecture tour or write a book, neither of which would be valid economic activity in many cases after leaving office. So, in summary, what is a PEP? No one knows. Even the Financial Action Task Force says that governments cannot be expected to produce a list of their own PEPs because it would be costly and time-consuming. The US State Department publishes a list of some current senior figures in many countries, but it is not a very extensive list, and there's no historical data available. The FCA and other regulators mostly tell you who is not a PEP, unless for some reason they should be treated as a PEP. I wish I had an answer for you, but the truth is, unless a person is clearly within the specific parameters set by your regulator, you won't know if you should have treated that person as a PEP or someone associated with them or family member until the regulator or prosecutor tells you that you should have included that person. It's up to you to decide which positions and what degree of seniority you choose, and to try using your usual background information supplier to include or exclude people, bearing in mind that you will rarely have a full picture of their financial position, of their connections and contacts, or their family to help you reach a conclusion. And that's why the Old Codgers Club is debating this subject. That's all for this edition of Basics. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to follow, like, share, and most of all watch FinCrimeTV.